listening to East County Magazine's Bookshelf. We interview creative minds and share their ideas. Here's your host, Annette Tour.
Welcome to East County Magazine Bookshelf. Today, it is my honor to introduce to you Cherie Kerr, award-winning filmmaker, director, producer, and author. She's the founding member of the renowned LA Groundlings and founder of the Orange County Crazies. Her indie mockumentary film, The Show Can't Go On, received numerous nominations and 9 wins at film festivals, including Best Feature Film and Best Director. Beyond filmmaking, Kerr is an accomplished author and comedy writer. Today, we will be talking about her award-winning book, Charlie's Notes. Cherie, I'm so excited to talk to you and to have you here on the show.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, Annette. Thank you.
So I absolutely loved this book, and I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Can you tell us more about the inspiration behind Charlie's Notes and what motivated you to write this memoir about your father?
Well, it was actually accidental, if you will. My father had planned at some point to write his own biography. He had worked with a lot of celebrities. He'd had a lot of very interesting things happen to him as a jazz musician. And he had this yellow oblong notepad where he had the names of everybody he worked with and the gigs he did, and he had it all organized. And then he was stricken with dementia and eventually Alzheimer's. And I knew there was no way he was going to be able to write this book. So my grieving process at beginning to lose him, knowing that that was inevitable, because I thought he would live forever. He was just wonderful and charming and kind and gentle and just so talented. I thought, I'm going to take his notes and I'm going to write this book as a memoir and as a tribute to him. And it took almost a day job. So I run a PR firm and I teach presentation and communication skills too through a company called Execuprov. And so weekends and nights, I just dedicated myself to this book and doing the research and interviewing family members and all that, and going through his notes and all his everything from his high school annual yearbook to all his, things that he had saved, and began to write the book. And it was actually very cathartic and very therapeutic for me to be able to focus on this, because I was grieving him. I was grieving the loss of him. And only 6 years earlier, we lost my mother very suddenly. That was just a horrible thing. She died of cancer, but it was very quick when she discovered it. And so I was kind of in a dark place anyway. But capturing my father's life and knowing that his story would be told was really critical to me. So it was a way for me to manage the sadness for the 8 years it took me to write it.
That's just beautiful. I grew very attached to your characters in your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you paint such a vivid portrait of each character and your family's history. How were you able to gather such accurate accounts and details that brought these characters to life?
Well, I started with my father's notes, as I mentioned, gathering everything I could. And then I began to talk to a couple of his siblings who were still alive. His younger brother, Louis, was still living. My Uncle Joe, who he was very attached to musically, they both were brilliant musicians. And my Uncle Joe was a great artist as well. I got with them and said, hey, give me all the notes of all the things you can think of. And I gave them periods of time in his background. But the one person who gave me almost everything, in fact, I flew to Niagara Falls to meet with my Aunt Mary, who you read about in the book. In the book, her real name was Maria Conchetta. And so she sat me down for 3 days with a tape recorder. She had a photographic memory. She was captivating. And she gave me dates and times and locations and events all stacked chronologically to help me tell the story, especially of when they were these 6 children, or there were 7 to begin with. Adelina died, but she gave me all the background and all the facts, so that, I mean, even the book is somewhat fictive in places, but not much. It's from memories of my father telling me about having worked with Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra and those people. So I remember some of that is, I don't want to say it's paraphrased, but it's not, detail by detail. But she gave me everything from their childhood. And my Uncle Joe, my father's older brother, his wife Dolores, also gave me a lot of history and note taking. His brother Louis, who I was very, very close to, the youngest of the males in the family, he also gave me a lot of information. So I captured their childhood based on their input to me, to their stories. But I'd heard a lot of them over the years because they were really kind of a very interesting, wacky, traditional immigrant family. And I was fascinated by that. So it took a lot of time to gather the information and then compartmentalize it in different decades and years and events and so on. And that was painstaking, but it was really helpful because I wanted to, the reason I wrote the book is because I wanted my children to know their history. I have a very close friend by the name of Gus Lee, and I don't know if you know about his book called China Boy. In fact, you might want to have him on at some point. He wrote a best-selling book. China Boy was bestseller on the New York Times best-selling list, I think in the early 90s. And he's Chinese, and his wife was an American. And he wanted his kids to know their history. So, and his books are just outstanding. So he wrote that story, and it was so beautifully done. And he said to me, you have a really interesting background. You should, when my father was getting ill, he said, you should do the same thing. You should write that story. And I thought, yeah, I want my kids and my grandkids and their kids to know where they came from and what it was like to grow up in that house. And I really felt like I was there, at the time as I was working on it. So that was a big influence. Gus Lee is a brilliant, prominent author and dear friend, and he did that. And it's a beautiful book. So I wanted to do something other. I've written all kinds of styles of writing, lyrics and sketches and stand-up comedy routines, and a lot of comedy mostly, and other books, business books for presentation and communication. But this was sort of like my dessert or my hobby or my go-to, to be alone and to enter that world and to capture it it was difficult. It took a long time to really work on the book, but I think it's, of all the things I've been graced and blessed to be able to do, this was definitely my favorite project.
Well, I have to say that as I was reading your book, I felt like I was there as well. Um,
Good.
so descriptive, and talking about your immigrant family coming to America. Your book touches on your Italian heritage and your father's connection to the jazz revolution. How did your family's cultural background influence your father's musical journey?
As the story goes, and it's in the book, my grandfather, Eugene Di Pietro, had a mandolin and he had a flute, and he loved to play music. And I'm not sure where he got his musical chops, but he played a lot around the kids. So as they were beginning to grow up, my grandfather had a good friend, Professor Joseph Russo was his name. And my grandfather was a tailor and said, hey, I'll make you some great suits, but will you teach my 2 of my kids, the violin? He was a violin teacher. And he said, okay. So I think his Eugene's love of music, and always played it and was singing around the house and all that, had a big influence on Joe, my Uncle Joe, and my father, Charlie. So they started lessons. My father started playing violin when he was 4. And as the story goes, he would sit at my grandmother's piano and play her piano, jazz, just anything abstract. And but yet he had this great ear. And his brother Joe, who was 4 years older, was, a very serious, consummate musician. And Charlie, as you read in the book, just wanted to be so much like Joe. But they were both equally as talented. But my Uncle Joe didn't make it like Charlie, my dad, did. But I think it was Eugene and his love of music and having available stuff, around the house and playing to the kids musically that started that influence. But something else that's interesting in that is that as I was getting into this book, I learned that Niagara Falls is not a big town in New York. Everybody knows it as the honeymoon place with the falls and all that. But there were 4 or 5 major Italian studio musicians in LA in the 40s and 50s that came from Niagara Falls, which is really interesting. And I think you may have read in that part in the book where you could sit out on your porch on a warm summer night in Niagara Falls in this one neighborhood, and you could hear all these young musicians play their instruments, most of whom played guitar. And I wish I could capture that. And I know you were asking me about it being very cinematic. I definitely want to make a movie of this book. That's my ultimate goal.
I definitely can't wait for you to do that because,
Oh, thank you.
as I was saying, when I was reading it, I felt like I was watching a movie. It was so descriptive, and
Thank you.
certain things really stood out in the book. Your father's musical journey took him to various places and allowed him to collaborate in movies that starred artists such as Elvis Presley, Audrey Hepburn, Charlton Heston, and Sophia Loren. How did these experiences shape his identity as a musician?
I think, he had big dreams when he came actually from Columbus, Ohio, to back to the falls to pack everything at their family. Well, let me just mention this. My father was in Niagara Falls and the war broke out. And so there was a chance for him, instead of going into the service where he didn't want to break his hands, he was a musician, was to work in a government role at Curtiss Wright Airplane Factory in Columbus, Ohio. He had a very close friend and childhood friend who ended up, being his best man in his wedding, who went to Curtiss Wright and said, "Hey, Charlie, come on over here. They pay well. You can work on the assembly line and make airplanes," which scares me because my father couldn't put a faucet together. So I have no idea how we won the war. But he moved there to Columbus, Ohio, and he was gigging at night as he could on his guitar. He was playing guitar by then. And Jack Teagarden and Bobby Hackett, who was a famous trumpet player, were in that bar, a place called, I think it was called the Waffle House or the Hoffle House or something. And they heard my dad play. He was 27 years old. And they approached him after the set and said, "You're amazing. We got to come to LA and join my band," is what Jack Teagarden said. So my mom and dad packed everything up, took my sister and I Niagara Falls and got all of our stuff. And then they came straight to California. So my dad could get here when I think it was late February or early March, something like that. And they said, "You're coming in another week or two." Well, when they got to LA, the band had disbanded. It fell apart. And my dad had no job. They didn't have money to get back to the falls. They didn't want to go back there because my dad knew, this was like in 1943, 44, 45 era, that everything was happening now in LA. It wasn't just in New York City. So they stayed. And in fact, they worked on a assembly line in a camera factory, putting cameras together, and then finally saved up enough money to have my mother's parents bring my sister and I to California. So it was about 8 months before we saw them again, which was very hard on both my parents. But then he just fell in love with the jazz scene, and he met a guy in one of the clubs who was working films. He was a sideman on a film, and said, "Oh, Charlie, they would love you. You play bass, you look great on camera," and so on. And he introduced my dad to one of the studio production managers. And from there, they just kept rehiring him. Mm-hmm. And then he also was getting a lot of side gigs at private parties. Those were the most fascinating stories. he would come home and late at night, of course, and my sister and I would get up early and sit with my mom and my dad at the kitchen table, and he would tell us everything that happened at the party, but we were all sworn to secrecy about it. And the most memorable party for me was when Judy Garland was there. It was her party, and she was singing, and my dad, just was fascinated by her. So that's how he got his reputation. Now, many of his friends went on to LA to become studio musicians, which I think my father wanted to do, but it was a lot of sacrifice to do it in the late 40s and early 50s. So he sort of bypassed that goal, opened a music store, but continued to play his side gigs they were called casuals at the time. And so he would be, in a trio or whatever and go to these famous people's houses. But I think my dad was so creative and such a gentle person and a very shy, humble person. I'm not so sure, as I look at it, that he had the aggressive personality that a lot of musicians need to have to just bulldoze their way into that business. But he certainly was worthy of it musically.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I remember reading in your book something like your dad was so creative and talented, and your mom had a strong drive. And if he had
Yes.
that combination, but I just remember reading the book and I felt so connected to Charlie. And when he got that break in the bar that you were mentioning, when
Yes.
Dak Teagarden came up to him and asked him to play that night, I was so excited. I felt like I was actually there and I almost like jumped for joy. Uh, um,
Oh,
so,
thank
and then
you.
also, as you mentioned, when he got to LA and the band broke apart, I'm just curious, how did he feel? I mean, I'm sure it was shattering, but was this a moment in your dad's life that he often talked about?
He didn't talk a lot about it, but I think, honestly, if I could be objective about him as a character, if you will, not just my precious father, I think he carried that disappointment for a long time because he had aspirations as a teenager and a lot of accolades from people in the community about his work. And my uncle, his brother as well. And I think that break was like a big Hollywood moment. And they did a big story in the Niagara Gazette about Charlie going to Hollywood and all. And I think he had his eye on that and really believed that that was going to happen. And it didn't happen in the way that he had hoped. And and then when my parents opened for Les Brown in his Band of Renown, which was very famous and popular at that time. And I think, and Les Brown asked my folks to go on the road with him. He had a big band, a great big band. And as you know in the book, they drove around so that Heather, my sister, and I wouldn't see them crying because they had to turn it down. They weren't going to leave us again.
Mhm.
So I think he always longed for that, but yet he would always tell me, so long as I can do my art, whatever it is or wherever it is, I'm happy. And I really think he was. He just loved to play, but he certainly was worthy of being up there with a lot of great musicians. But after that, he didn't get the breaks that a lot of other people get.
Mhm.
And I think that's what makes the book so poignant to me. I think we read a lot of books about biographies of famous people and this jazz musician growing up in this ghetto or this community and not having parents around, or all these great stories that you read about. Louis Armstrong being one of them, a lot of other players. But my father was an ordinary person and an ordinary musician who just happened to be brilliantly gifted, but yet didn't make the big time. And I think that makes it even a better story. He had a great life and he was able to play up until his memory wouldn't connect him with the music anymore. But I think he was a great success in that, in that way. But to me, the book was not about, oh, here's another famous person and let's tell their story. No, here's an ordinary person who had, in many ways, an extraordinary life. And in other ways, didn't catch that boat. It should have.
Well, while I was reading the book, I thought stumbled upon an important message. Is when Charlie was young and he was so proud when he played so well. And Russo, as you mentioned, the music
Yes.
teacher stated to him, but something to the fact where, what do you want to be when you're older? And he said, I just want to be famous. And Russo said to him, no, not famous. You want to be the best.
Right.
As when you're the best, you'll be playing with the best. Anyone could be
Mhm.
famous, but not everyone that's famous is the best. And I loved that quote. That quote really stood out and throughout the book because your dad truly was the best, in what he did.
He was among the best. He was that has such a combination of everything it takes to be just a brilliant musician.
Hmm.
He had the emotional part of it. He had the technical part of it, the theoretical part of the music theory. He was very blessed to have been able to start to play at that age and gain that kind of talent. But you're right. It was all about being the best at what you could do. And there would always, he would tell me, and my mother as well, there's always people who can do something better than you can. And there's a lot of people who will look up to you because they can't do what you can do. But don't even think about that. Just think about you having a lot of integrity in your work, whatever it is, and always do your best performance, whether you're ironing a t-shirt or you're directing a show. Just give it your best every time, and take it as though this is the only performance you will ever do, and give it everything you have. And I think we sort of grew up with that theory. My sister and I both, our parents were extraordinary people. They really were. They had come both from, as you know in the book, very humble and meager beginnings, and worked very hard to get to where they were, just in life, not a lot of fame, not a lot of money,
Hmm.
but just rich with the way they lived and loved. It was really remarkable. And my sister and I would laugh about how then after we left the house, we got into the real world to see what life was really like, and how we didn't really even begin to appreciate how lucky we were to grow up in that house. There was always music playing, and my mother was dancing and singing, and my father was, would turn on the radio and he would play, he would rehearse and practice against certain songs that he was listening to. And I remember one of my favorite stories, I don't think it's in the book, was when I was sitting on the sofa. I don't think I was more than 4, maybe, or 5, because we had just moved to LA. And he was practicing on his bass a certain song. And he said, you have to be able to move your head. You got to bob your head to the beat. And for some reason, I'm very musical, but I mean, I'll play an instrument, but I have a good sense of time, musicality. I couldn't get what he wanted. And he said, you can't go outside and play until you get it. So I had to sit on that couch with him, and I finally got the groove. And that's just how he rolled. I mean, that's just how it was in the house. All the time, there's always music. But we were not allowed to listen to anything but classical or jazz. Couldn't have pop. Um, we couldn't have country, no other genres except for those two art forms.
Why weren't you allowed to listen to country or any other forms?
And I think my father, in some regards, was a musical snob, and he felt like classical, and that's what he grew up on. That's what he cut his teeth on, and of course deviated from that to jazz, which is I think it's like the PhD of musical
Hmm.
work. Um, it was just that's where their heads were, and they didn't like the sound of country. I think, and my father, at the end of his life would say to me, because I point out certain country artists. I'm not a big country lover either, but I like some things that are well produced. And he would say, and I liked a lot of rock bands, of course, as I was growing up. And he said, I like all music so long as it's performed well. So I think he had broadened his horizons as he got older and really began to appreciate bands like Chicago and Earth, Wind and Fire, and um, Hall and Oates and other musicians who were really very well trained and played well and had great arrangements, but they weren't as confined to those art forms. But I think that's what they were taught as growing up too, that those were the only kinds of music that were worthy of being played. So I think they kind of passed that on to us. I remember my sister, this is a funny thing too. She bought my dad had a record store, and at that time he had a little 45 records, that you would buy. And she wanted Teresa Brewer, I think her name was, singing Bell Bottom Blues. It was some kind of hokey pop number at the time. And because he would let us each have a record each week. And I wanted Sarah Vaughan singing, I forget what, she's a great jazz vocalist. I don't know if you know her work, but she's incredible. And so my dad, I ended up on his favorite list for quite a while because Heather had the song that he couldn't stand. And she made sure she didn't play it when he was at home. She would only play it when he wasn't there. So we had some kind of silly rules, but I think my father was just a purist when it came to music, in those days. And as he got older, I think he began to appreciate a lot of the jazz influence in the rock bands and, bands like Chicago, like Earth, Wind and Fire, people who were, orchestrally, I don't even know if that's a word, very sound and very accomplished.
Yes. Well, being in the music industry during a significant era, your father likely witnessed the evolution of music and culture. How did he adapt to these changes, and did it influence his own music?
I think so. The jazz capital of the world in 1940, for instance, when he went on his honeymoon to New York City to watch Joe Marsala and some other great musicians of that time. And as you know, in the book, he ended up sitting in with them and they wanted him to stay. But I think that's where it was all happening. Then when my father moved to LA, right in the mid 40s, I think it was 1944 or 45 when they were here, all of a sudden these people from the East Coast were, emerging in all these clubs in LA. And then it got to be kind of the hip happening, Shelley Man's Manhole and all these other places. And I think that he was kind of rode that wave with that change in the geography, if you will, of where jazz was so hot. And of course, New York is always hot and always will be. But LA really became the scene, the jazz scene in the mid to late 40s and early 50s. And I think it did change, not necessarily the way he played, but he was able to keep up, with all the big band changes. He was a big band guy. He loved Count Basie and he loved Woody Herman and, some of the other big bands that played. And that's really what he wanted to do. But he also wrote a lot of incredible arrangements that were played that people really enjoyed. So his last gigs were at a bar near you called the Belly Up, I think it's in San Diego
Beach, I think.
area. Yeah, and he played with a band called the Gold Tones or something, and they were a big band, and they were all people who had been with big bands who got together to jam. I think it was every Sunday. So that he was kind of on the crest of riding with all these other musicians where the styles of music were changing. And in the book, you'll read where my father and my Uncle Joe would sneak the radio in their bedroom and turn on jazz that was playing in New Orleans and places like that on the radio, which my grandfather prohibited for a long time. It was only classical music in that house. And so they kind of knew the birth and growth of Louis Armstrong and some of the other musicians, that played and then emerged from there and then migrated to New York and then ultimately in LA. So he seemed to be on that same surfboard, with a lot of the people who were also going through those cultural musical changes. And he was lucky to be in that era instead of behind it or in front of it where he wouldn't have experienced it.
Yeah, it was definitely a beautiful era of music.
Yeah.
Your deep love and admiration for your father shine through in the book. I know you mentioned it was emotional, but how emotional was it capturing his life on paper? Um, did you have to take breaks, or were you able to go right through every page?
No, first of all, as I wrote the book, every word, every page, I had music playing. I had jazz playing. I was listening to Diana Krall. I was listening to Bill Evans. I was listening to Manhattan Transfer. I was listening to all the artists that Diane Shure, all these artists that he loved. And that sort of popped me up and kept me going. But there was a couple of chapters, the one chapter called The Ball, if you remember that, where he was going to take Virginia to the prom and her father wouldn't let her go because he considered my father a low-life Italian. And I can't even talk about it with almost crying. And then he ended up going back home with a corsage and his brother's shoes that were too tight and his tuxedo that he had and didn't get to go to that dance. And I would have to stop in the middle of some of it because I just couldn't write it. And my Aunt Mary really helped me through that because she was there and she remembered every nuance, every single thing that they said and how the family reacted. So that was a very hard chapter for me to write. There were several where I did have to stop for a while and just step aside because I was getting, just too emotional. But there were a lot of times as I was writing, I was crying while I was doing it. But it was therapeutic.
Huh.
So it was fine. But I always had jazz playing as I was writing.
Well, it's absolutely amazing. I could feel that intensity on every page as I
Oh,
was reading.
thank you.
Did your father ever share any anecdotes or insights about working with Elvis or other famous artists that you like to share with your readers?
Well, what I thought was interesting because he would always come home again and tell us what happened on the set or what happened at the party. And again, we were all sworn to secrecy. So even some of the chapters, like there's a chapter on Elvis, there's one on Sinatra. I don't tell all. I just gave some of the information. But I do remember my father not liking Elvis Presley. He didn't like rock and roll. He thought that was, we couldn't have that in the house either. Um, and so, but he adored Sinatra and just thought he was the end all of music.
Mhm.
But when he came home after working with Elvis, he had a very different perspective. He said he was such a gentleman and so humble and so kind. And he said, I just so enjoyed working with him. And I believe Love Me Tender is the film that my dad was in. I think it was Elvis's first movie, if I'm not mistaken. But he said he was just the nicest guy, but very shy, extremely shy. And then Sinatra, on the other hand, although he really enjoyed doing that film, he said he was, had a lot of swag and a lot of women around him, and everybody, he snapped his fingers, give me a cigarette, give me a drink, give me whatever. And he wasn't as friendly or as fun as it was working, with Elvis or Danny Kaye or some of the other people he worked with. And, he was never imposing on these people. He wasn't looking for photo ops. I mean, you didn't do that in that day. But a couple of times he got some photos. But I was always interested in knowing what these people were really like. Were they nice and were they kind? And I know Elizabeth Taylor had, obviously, from what I was told, a real crush on my dad. She saw him and locked eyes and went, wow. Because my father was a very good looking man, very handsome man, and very charming, very magnetic. So, we got to hear things like that. It was interesting to find out what their personalities were really like. Were they still funny all of the time, or were they a whole different personality? And that was fun to learn about. I loved the backstory. I loved hearing about what people wore. My mother was like, what did they wear? What color was June Allison wearing at that party? What did the tables look like? What were the centerpieces like? And so that was really kind of fun, to get all of that.
Incredible.
And
So
in fact, I wished he had still been living
yes.
or in his right mind when I was writing the book, because there's so much more. I'm sure he would have told me that, because he had a great, ironically, memory
Mhm.
as a younger person, that I could have gotten probably more detail. But by the time I got to the book, which is in like 1995, I think it was, by the time I got there, he had really slipped a lot, and there wasn't much I could have asked him, after that. So I had to go by notes. I had to go by things that I recall them talking about, and just leave it at that. Describe it as best I could.
Well, I'm sure he would be extremely proud. As I was reading the book, I couldn't help but sneak to the middle where you had a bunch of family photographs, and it
Oh
really
yeah.
added a personal touch to the narrative. Could you describe one or two of your favorite photos and the memories associated with them?
I think one of my favorite photos is a photo of my dad on a bandstand sitting playing guitar with my mother with the microphone, because she ended up joining his band. It was Joe's band, my Uncle Joe's band, but my dad was in it. And then my mother ended up becoming the vocalist for the band. And it's a picture of her in the middle of a song while my father, was sitting in the background behind her playing. And that's a really special photo. I think the other one, there's a couple of family photos of him with his brothers when they were younger, and just looking at their meager backgrounds and are interesting. And another favorite photo of mine, I don't know why, but it is my grandfather Eugene had a tailor shop, as you know, and his brother, one surviving brother out of four brothers, ended up in the tailor shop with him. And they had so little money for that shop. They had really beautiful clothes hanging and all these ties and shirts, and you could see them, but the floor was dirt. They had no money for any kind of flooring for a long time. And my Aunt Mary would sweep that dirt and make it, look really nice and even and all that. So that was a really touching thing to me, to think. I don't know if a lot of people realize how lucky they are to be in this country, and how much they know about their grandparents or great grandparents, and what they suffered or what they went through to come here, just to be middle class people, if even that level, and the conditions that they lived in. I just had such reverence for the whole concept of immigrants coming here for a better life. It did change my perspective in many ways. I mean, I was never um, uh, any kind of a racist, or I never had any views of looking down on anybody, because we didn't have that. That's not how our house ever was, not how we were raised. But I just had a greater empathy for the struggle of day-to-day life of people who come here. And I always try to have a lot of compassion for anyone who's here and doesn't know the language, or doesn't have the means to
Mm,
live well, or doesn't have enough food to eat.
mm.
Those things really hit me hard when I was writing that book, and I began to be far more appreciative of what we have here in the United States of America.
I absolutely agree with you. And I actually felt the same way as I was reading the book, how lucky we are right now, and how hard people coming to this country had to work, but how they had the hope of making it with hard work. Uh,
Yeah.
in your memoir, you beautifully describe your father's musical journey. Can you elaborate on how his musical career impacted your own life and perspective?
Yeah, I think so. The bulk of my life has been in comedy, improv comedy, sketch comedy, and somewhat stand-up comedy. And I know that you have to have a great sense of time, a great musicality in your ear, to be able to do comedy. It's a heavily reliant on knowing exactly when to pause and where to hit the high notes and so on. And I could never play. I didn't have the aptitude to play a musical instrument, even though my father tried so hard to get me started me with a violin. And then the last attempt on his part was to bring home a tuba, because he thought I think Cherie will find that really fun. And I couldn't do that either. But I think in the process of just osmosis, by being around it and living it, his musicality and that of my mother as well had a big influence on how the timing of how I write my prose or my work, how I did my comedy and directed and all. It's a tremendous influence on not only my work ethic and my ethic in that in delivering that kind of work, but also just having a great ear to know what works and what doesn't work. And I really credit my dad for and my mother as well. She was a great musician. She was very talented.
Hmm.
And I think that I was lucky to be in that house, to be around that atmosphere all the time, to pick that up, because I don't think some people have it innately, which I think is wonderful. But I think it was more the environment for me that I was able to pick up a sense of time, which is critical.
That's a beautiful environment to grow up in, to have music and dancing. I mean, I just love listening to that. Um, and while we're talking about this, I know you spoke that this book may be out in a as a movie, and because I couldn't help be struck by the vivid imagery that made me feel like I was watching a movie. Are there any plans to making this into a movie or any type of series to bring it to a wider audience
You know, I
in the
would
future?
love to do that. It requires that the problem I'm having, because I've made 4 films now, indie films, but they're all comedies and they didn't require a lot of stuff. Because this book would be a period piece, it would cost a lot of money to produce it. So I don't have the financing. I wish I did. And you've inspired me today to get back on that effort and try to find somebody who might really like the book to make it into a series for like a Netflix series or something like that, or to make it into a feature. And I would love to write the screenplay. I already have in mind how I would treat that, according to the book, and would love to direct the film as well. But it's a matter of financing. So I need several $1 million to make it happen. But I haven't given up on that. I just need to pay a little bit more attention to pursuing that. But I know it's not an easy thing to do.
Not an easy thing, but I'm sure that's hopeful for a plan in the future. I hope so. What advice for other writers do you have if they want to go about writing a book based on their family?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And it's not as easy as one would think. I think when I was writing the book, I felt that my family would really appreciate it. And oh boy, this is great. I have Charlie's story and everything. And most everyone did. But there were a couple of relatives, including his youngest sister, who absolutely hated me for having written the book. Her mother was a very difficult character in the book, as you know, and I only met her, I think, a couple of times. So I didn't really know her. I went by information I was given from all the siblings who all had the same take on her. And she was a very unhappy, obviously a very unhappy person. And so I characterized her the way I was given the information. And my aunt was furious with me. She wouldn't talk to me for years. And she died of COVID just a couple of years ago. And we finally made peace before she left. But I certainly didn't write it to upset anybody. But people I know who have written memoirs about their families have had similar problems where they they wrote about a character the way that they thought they perceived it, or somebody gave them the information for it, but yet the person who was on the other end, a family member, stopped speaking to them. And I guess for some people it's just too personal. To me, I certainly didn't set out to upset or hurt anybody's feelings. I just wanted to tell my dad's story, and I wanted it to be as authentic and close to the truth, which it is, as it could be. So I think you have to be really careful. You have to assess that. Is it really worth it to write a book that might upset somebody in your family if you're including them as characters in the book? And some people don't care. And some people stop with the whole idea because they don't want to upset anybody.
I'm sure your dad would be very, very proud of you.
And
And
I don't know. I worry about that because my Aunt Ida was so angry with me. And
yeah,
I'm thinking, gosh, I would hope that he would be
I
happy with
think
the book,
so.
that I would have done that for him.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, when had finished the book and pretty much finished it, and within 3 weeks of me completing the book, he passed away. So I had to go back and rewrite the ending, to all the way through, him taking literally his last breath. So I think sometimes I wonder if it would have been okay to talk about that, or if it would have instead, made him uncomfortable. I don't know. I'm just glad I wrote it. I did it, and it's done well. It won some awards, and I'm hoping it'll go to a film because I think it's a wonderful story.
I think it's an incredible story, and
Oh,
I'm
thank you,
so happy
Annette.
you
Thank
wrote
you.
it. And I want to say you can't please everyone. There's always going to be someone who won't be happy with it. But there are a lot of people who are happy with it. So I thank you, Cherie, for being on the show. I was deeply moved by your writing, and
Oh,
you
thank
truly
you.
are a Renaissance woman. The book is Charlie's Notes, and I can't wait to see this fantastic book made into a movie, allowing people to enjoy its rich cultural content.
Well, thank you, Annette. And if there's anybody out there who wants to join me in producing the film, I'm all ears. I would love to be able to connect with them. So thank you for that opportunity and for mentioning that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.